They gave me 40 minutes to speak. I used 37 of them, telling the most powerful assembly in the known galaxy that they were about to make the worst mistake in the history of our civilization. When I finished, the chamber was so quiet that I could hear the ventilation systems humming in the walls. Then Grand Counselor Zareth stood up, smoothed his ceremonial robes, and said, "Thank you, General Breathen. Your concern has been noted." That was it. 40 years of service, 14 cycles spent crawling through the mud and the misery of one primitive world, watching creatures that had no business surviving anything continue to survive everything, and the Grand Council gave me the same response they reserved for bureaucratic complaints about supply chain delays. I had known, of course, that this would happen. You do not rise to the rank of High General in the Dominion Galactic Empire without understanding how the Council operates. They were not a body built for caution, they were built for conquest. Every pillar in that chamber was carved from stone taken from a world the Empire had absorbed. Every banner hanging from the ceiling bore the sigil of a civilization that no longer existed. As an independent entity, the room itself was a monument to the Council's fundamental belief that the universe yielded to those strong enough to take it. I had believed that once for a very long time. I had believed exactly that. My name is Rithan. I am or was the Supreme Field Commander of the 3rd Dominion Expansion Fleet. I have conducted 61 planetary assessment missions over the course of my career. I have overseen the formal integration of 19 worlds into the Galactic Empire. I have received more medals than I have fingers to count them on, and I have attended the victory ceremonies for every single one of those integrations, wearing the dress uniform that my father wore before me. I am telling you this not to impress you. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that when I stood before the Grand Council on the day of the Soul System vote, I was not some nervous young officer speaking out of turn. I was the most experienced military mind in that room. I had earned the right to be heard, and they heard me, and they dismissed me, and in doing so they set the entire empire on a course that none of us could have predicted, and none of us could stop. The morning of the council session had begun the way all mornings began on Dominax, with the deep amber glow of our sun ashing over the capital skyline, the air carrying the sharp mineral scent that I had grown up with and never quite been able to stop missing when I was away on assignment. My aide, a young officer named Threx, had woken me 2 hours before the session to go over my prepared remarks one final time. I had not prepared remarks. Threx had looked at me with that expression junior officers always got when their commanding general said something that implied a significant deviation from protocol. "High General," he had said carefully, "the session begins in 2 hours. The council will expect a formal presentation. The council will expect me to stand up there and tell them that invading the Sol System is a brilliant idea and that we should begin immediately." I had said I am going to disappoint them. Threx had spent the next 90 minutes trying to convince me to at least bring prepared remarks as a backup. I had spent those 90 minutes reviewing the field files I had compiled over 14 cycles of observation on Earth. One more time, making sure that every fact I intended to present was burned into my memory so thoroughly that no amount of council pressure could shake them loose, the Grand Council chamber. Seated 12,000 delegates, every seat had been filled by the time I walked in. This was unusual. Most council sessions on expansion proposals drew a moderate audience of bureaucrats and military liaison. The Sol System vote had drawn everyone, representatives from every major sector, every allied civilization, every client state that had pledged loyalty to the empire and earned a voice in its governance had traveled to Dominax for this specific session. The reason was simple. Earth was not just another expansion target. Earth was the beginning of the Empire's push into the Fourth Galactic Arm, a region of space that had never been formally charted or claimed. Whoever controlled the Sol System controlled the gateway to that entire unexplored region. The economic value alone was enough to make even the most conservative councilors vote in favor. The strategic value made it essentially a foregone conclusion, and the humans themselves, they were in the Empire's assessment a non-factor. I had read the intelligence briefings prepared by the Observation Division. I had read them very carefully, and I had found them to be not incorrect exactly, but catastrophically incomplete. The briefings described human beings in purely physical and technological terms. Short-lived species, average lifespan approximately 70 to 90 of their years. Physically fragile by Dominion standards, with no natural armor, limited strength, and a notable susceptibility to a wide range of environmental conditions. Technologically precont, meaning they had not yet developed faster than light travel, energy shielding, or directed energy weapons. Their most advanced military hardware relied on chemically propelled projectiles and explosives. On paper they were nothing. On paper the Dominion's smallest frigate could reduce their most powerful military force to rubble in an afternoon. The briefing said nothing about what those numbers actually meant when you watched them in motion. Nothing about what it felt like to stand at the edge of a human conflict and observe species-wide patterns that the Observation Division's analysts had apparently never considered worth documenting. When my turn came to speak, I walked to the center of the chamber. Floor stood in the speaker circle and looked out at 12,000 faces from across the Dominion's vast collection of member civilizations. Some were curious, most were impatient. A few near the back were already consulting secondary screens, conducting other business, having decided that whatever the old general had to say was not worth their full attention. I understood the impulse. I did not forgive it. Hi, General V. Than, said the session moderator, a slender diplomat named Counselor P., whom I had known for 30 years. You have requested special time before the final vote on Proposal 77 KE, the Sol System Acquisition Initiative. The floor is yours. Thank you, I said, my voice carried well in that chamber. 40 years of giving orders in battlefield conditions had given me a voice that did not require amplification. I want to begin by acknowledging something that every delegate in this room already knows. I am the ranking military officer present today. I have more direct field experience with planetary integration operations than any other active service officer in the Dominion. My record speaks for itself, and I will not waste your time reciting it. I paused, letting the room settle. What I will tell you is this: 14 cycles ago, I volunteered for the Sol System long-term observation. Detail. I spent 14 cycles on Earth, not in orbit, not reviewing reports from a comfortable station on the surface, living among the humans, studying them. The way you study something when you genuinely want to understand it rather than simply categorize it. I have filed reports with the Observation Division. Throughout that entire period, I have submitted 17 formal requests for a comprehensive reassessment of Earth's threat classification. All 17 were denied or tabled. A murmur moved through the chamber. Counselor Zareth, seated at the central dais with the other senior counselors, had a look on his face that suggested he already knew where this was going and was already composing his dismissal. The Observation Division's briefing tells you that humans are a Class 3 primitive species with no capacity to resist integration. I am here to tell you that that classification is wrong, not partially wrong, fundamentally wrong, wrong in ways that will cost us dearly if we proceed with Proposal 77 KTH. That woke up the delegates at the back who had been consulting their secondary screens. Humanity's physical and technological limitations are real, I continued. I am not disputing the data. What I am disputing is the interpretation of that data. The Observation Division looked at what humans cannot do and concluded that they are weak. I looked at what humans actually do when faced with conditions that should destroy them, and I reached a very different conclusion. I had prepared no visual aids. I had considered it and rejected it because I knew that no image or data chart could communicate what I needed to communicate. Some things had to be said plainly, person to person, and trusted to land on their own weight. I've watched a human soldier absorb wounds that would end 3 Dominion troopers, get back to his feet, and carry 2 injured comrades out of danger before allowing anyone to treat his own injuries. I have watched a human settlement be reduced to rubble by a natural disaster that would have permanently broken any of the 19 worlds I have helped integrate, and I have watched that settlement be rebuilt better than before within 2 of their years. I have watched humanity fight 2 global-scale conflicts within living memory, lose more of its own people than most species have in their entire recorded histories, and come out of both of those conflicts not diminished but fundamentally stronger, more organized, more technologically capable, and more determined than they were going in. Chamber was quiet now, all of it. Even Counselor Zareth was listening. There is something about this species that the Observation Division cannot measure because they have never seen it before. I'm not sure I have the right word for it in our language. The closest I can come is this: humans do not simply endure hardship, they are made by it. Every catastrophe they survive leaves them with knowledge and capability, and a kind of ferocious collective memory that they carry forward and apply to the next catastrophe. They are in the most literal sense the most adaptive species I have ever encountered in 61 planetary assessments, and I have assessed species that have been developing for 10 times as long. I looked directly at Counselor Zareth. I'm not asking the Council to abandon expansion into the 4th arm. I am asking the Council to choose a different entry point. I am asking you to recognize that the Sol system is not, as the briefing suggests, an easy acquisition. It is a trap, not a trap that the humans have set for us. They do not know we exist, or they did not until recently. It is a trap that we are setting for ourselves by looking at an unfamiliar type of strength and mistaking it for weakness because it does not look like anything we have seen. Before I stepped back, that is all I have to say. Counselor Zareth waited exactly 3 seconds before he stood. In 30 years of knowing the man, I had never seen him wait even 1 second before responding to something he disagreed with. Those 3 seconds told me he had felt at least something of what I had said. It also told me it was not enough. "Thank you, General Breathen," he said. "Your concern has been noted." The vote was called 90 minutes later. The result was 412 in favor, 11 opposed. I was one of the 11. I noted the names of the other 10, not because I thought we would need to find each other later, but because I wanted to remember that there had been others, that I had not been entirely alone in that room. Threx found me in the corridor outside the chamber. Afterward, he was quiet for a long time, walking beside me, and then he said, "What happens now, sir?" I thought about the 14 cycles I had spent on Earth. I thought about a man named Oliver, a human I had observed for 6 of those cycles, a soldier who had served in 3 separate armed conflicts, survived all of them, and then spent the rest of his life teaching younger soldiers how to do the same. I had watched Oliver teach a group of young recruits in a field one rainy afternoon, and what I remembered most was not what he had said, but how he had said it with absolute certainty, with the unshakable confidence of someone who had been tested by the worst the world could offer and had come out the other side still standing. "What happens now," I said to Threx, "is that the Empire invades Earth." I paused, "and then we find out whether I was right." I already knew the answer. I had known it for 14 cycles. The Observation Division had given me a cover identity when I first arrived on Earth. I was to be a researcher studying at one of their academic institutions in a region called England, in a country they called the United Kingdom. My physical form adjusted through biosculpting to approximate human proportions past casual inspection. My language implants handled communication. My cover documents generated by the division's forgery unit were considered solid enough to hold up to any scrutiny of pre-Kant civilization could apply. I arrived in early spring. The weather was gray and cold and wet in a way that seemed almost personal, as if the sky itself was commenting on my presence. I remember stepping out of the transport that had deposited me in a narrow street of old stone buildings, pulling my coat tighter against the wind and thinking that this was perhaps the least impressive planet I had ever been assigned to observe. I was wrong about that. Within the first week, my academic cover placed me in contact with a woman named Caroline, a professor of what the humans called military history. She was perhaps 60 years old, white-haired, with a dry sense of humor and an encyclopedic memory that embarrassed most of her colleagues. I had been assigned to audit her lectures as part of my academic cover, and I had expected to find them useful primarily as language practice. What I found instead changed the entire direction of my observation. Caroline taught the history of human conflict, not as a sequence of dates and battles, but as a record of human psychology. Under extreme pressure, she taught it as the story of what humans became when everything was taken from them, and what I heard in her lectures illustrated through centuries of examples from conflicts I had no prior knowledge of. was a pattern so consistent and so extraordinary that I began taking detailed notes not for my cover but for my actual reports. The pattern was this: humans, when pushed to the absolute limit of what they could endure, did not break in the way that virtually every other species I had studied broke. They did not collapse into disorder or retreat into passivity or fragment into competing fangons that turned on each other. Some of that happened, yes, in individual cases, but at the species level, under genuine existential pressure, humans did something that I had never observed in any other civilization I had assessed. They organized not slowly, not tentatively, with a speed and coherence that seemed to bypass every normal social friction that otherwise made human civilization so chaotic and difficult to predict. When the pressure was great enough, when the threat was clear enough, humans set aside the thousand disagreements and rivalries and ancient grudges that normally define their relationships, and they became briefly but genuinely single organism with a single purpose. I had spent my first 3 cycles on Earth cataloging their divisions, and there where many humans had divided themselves along every conceivable axis: geography, language, religion, resources, history, ideology. They had been fighting each other since before they had writing to record the facts. Their conflicts were frequent and sometimes devastatingly destructive. I had watched recordings of their most recent global-scale wars and come away genuinely shocked by the scale of the casualties they had inflicted on each other. Any other species would have been permanently changed by those losses. Reduced credit, the humans had emerged from both those conflicts and built the most productive and interconnected civilization they had ever had. Within 2 generations of the worst destruction they had ever experienced, they were traveling to their own moon. Caroline had a phrase for this that I wrote down and carried with me for the rest of my time on Earth. We are catastrophe adapted, she said it once in a lecture, almost as an aside, and then moved on as if it were an obvious and unremarkable observation, as if every species in the universe worked this way. It was not obvious, it was not unremarkable, it was, in my professional assessment, the single most important fact about humanity, and it was entirely absent from the observation divisions. Briefing documents I transferred from academic observation to field observation. In my 4th cycle, my new cover placed me as a civilian contractor working adjacent to one of their military training facilities in a region called Wales. The facility trained a specific class of soldier, what the humans called Special Operations Forces. These were not regular military personnel. They were individuals who had been selected out of hundreds of applicants for their ability to function under conditions that the military itself considered extreme. The selection process alone took months. I watched candidates go through physical challenges that seemed designed less to train them and more to find the ones who simply would not stop. The training staff would push a candidate past the point where any rational organism would conclude that continuing was no longer a viable option, and what they were watching for was not physical endurance, though that mattered. What they were watching for was what happened in the candidate's mind when everything hurt and nothing was working and there was no obvious path forward. Most candidates would reach that point and recalculate. They would determine correctly from a pure survival logic standpoint that the cost of continuing was too high. They would stop. The ones who passed would not stop. I want to be precise about what I mean because I have thought about this a great deal. It was not that they felt no pain or no exhaustion or no doubt. The physiological monitoring data I was able to obtain made it clear that they experienced all of those things at levels that were genuinely extreme. What was different was what those sensations produced in them. In most organisms, including most Dominion citizens, extreme discomfort produces one overwhelming drive: escape. In the discomfort, retreat. In these particular humans, extreme discomfort produced something that the monitoring data could not capture, but that I could observe in their faces and their body language and their decisions. It produced a kind of cold focus, as if the pain were a signal not to stop but to pay closer attention, as if the harder things got, the more present and deliberate and determined they became. One candidate in particular stays with me. His name was Danny, and he was not, by objective measures, the strongest or fastest or most physically capable person in his intake group. He was mid-range on almost every physical metric. But in the selection process, when his intake group was on their third consecutive day without sleep, carrying weighted packs up a mountain in driving rain, and candidates were stopping every few hours as their bodies and minds finally reached their limit, Danny had done something that I had never seen before and have never forgotten. He had started talking to the mountain, not loudly, not in a way that suggested any kind of psychological break. Quietly, between steps, he was having a conversation with the slope, with the rain, with the weight on his back. I could not hear all of what he said, but I heard enough. He was arguing, he was telling the mountain with complete sincerity that it was not going to win, that he had been through harder things than this, that he was going to make it to the top, not because he felt confident, but because he had decided, and his decisions meant more to him than his feelings did. He made it to the top. He was one of 4 candidates from his intake group who completed the selection. I filed a report about Danny. I filed reports about Caroline in her lectures. I filed 17 reports over 14 cycles that tried in the formal language of Dominion military intelligence to convey what I was observing. The Observation Division classified all of them as supplementary cultural data and attached them to my main file, where they were available but clearly not read. In my 6th cycle, I embedded with a different type of human institution. Their emergency response services, the ones who ran toward disasters while everyone else ran away. These were not soldiers. They were not specially selected in the way Danny and LT Unk and GT Y's unit had been. They were ordinary citizens who had applied for jobs and been given training and were now, as a matter of daily professional routine, responsible for entering burning buildings, pulling injured people out of crushed vehicles, responding to incidents that most would consider the worst moment of their entire lives. And these workers considered a Tuesday. What struck me was the culture they had built around this work, the dark humor which outsiders sometimes found disturbing, but which served a very specific psychological function. It created distance from the worst of what they saw without creating indifference to it. The rituals they maintained around the loss of a colleague, which were solemn and meaningful in a way that told me these People understood loss intimately and had built precise, emotional architecture around it rather than simply enduring it, the way they talked about fear not as something to be eliminated, but as something to be acknowledged, managed, and ultimately set aside in the moment. When action was required, a paramedic named George, whom I worked alongside for the better part of a year under my cover as a civilian administrative contractor, put it more simply than I ever could. We were sitting in the station one evening after a particularly difficult shift, and I asked him, carefully within the parameters of my cover identity, how he kept doing the work, how he came back the next day and the next. George was quiet for a moment. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, with tired eyes and a coffee cup he had been refilling since 5 in the morning. He thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. You know what? The worst part is, he said, it's not what you see on the job, it's the moment. The night before, when you're lying in bed and you think, what if tomorrow is the day I'm not enough? What if tomorrow something happens that I can't fix? He drank his coffee, and then you get up the next morning and go to work anyway. Because the only thing worse than being afraid of not being enough is not trying. I wrote that down verbatim. I put it in my 9th report to the Observation Division under the heading Core Psychological Architecture. They categorized it as anecdotal cultural observation. In my 9th cycle, I relocated to a region called the United States. This was the dominant military power on the planet at the time of my observation, and I wanted to understand how their military institutions thought. I embedded within a research facility adjacent to one of their large naval installations, working under a cover identity as an academic analyst. The human military had a concept they called doctrine, which was their organized body of thinking about how warfare should be conducted. What interested me was not the doctrine itself, but how rapidly and honestly they updated it. When a strategy failed, when a conflict produced outcomes that the doctrine had not predicted, the institution did not defend the doctrine, it revised it. It conducted what they called after-action reviews, formal processes for examining what had gone wrong without assigning blame, focused purely on learning. The goal was not to protect institutional pride, the goal was to be better next time. I had been in the Dominion military for 40 years. I could count on one hand the number of genuine, honest after-action reviews I had been part of. In the Dominion, when something went wrong, the priority was determining who was responsible so that responsibility could be managed and the institution could continue to believe in its own competence. The idea of systematically assuming that your methods were imperfect and building processes to identify and correct those imperfections was not part of how we operated. Humans did this constantly at every level, from the largest military institutions to individual units. The culture of honest self-assessment ran through their entire armed forces like a structural feature. It was not comfortable for them. I watched officers sit through after-action reviews where their decisions were picked apart in front of their colleagues, and comfort was clearly not the point. The point was getting better. The point was ensuring that next time the outcome would be different. A colonel named Allen, who ran one of the training programs at the facility, had a phrase he used with his trainees that I heard repeatedly. Enemy gets a vote. he used it to mean that no plan survived contact with an opponent who was actively trying to defeat it, that however good your strategy was in theory, the reality of conflict would introduce variables you had not anticipated, and your ability to adapt in that moment was more important than the elegance of your original plan. I thought about that phrase often during my time on Earth. I think about it still. In my 11th cycle, I observed something that I consider the single most important data point of my entire 14-cycle assignment. It was not a military exercise or a training scenario. It was something I witnessed on a quiet street in a mid-sized city in a region called Pacific Northwest of North America. I was walking back to my lodgings one evening when I came across an accident. A vehicle had collided with another at an intersection and overturned. Several bystanders had already gathered. One of the people in the overturned vehicle was conscious and calling for help. The other was not moving and appeared seriously injured. What happened next took approximately 4 minutes in total. The first bystander on the scene was a young woman named Emma. I learned her name later from the news coverage. Emma had no medical training. She had no relevant professional experience. She had her phone in her hands and a total absence of hesitation. Within 30 seconds of arriving, she had called for emergency services, established that the unconscious person was still breathing, and positioned herself to maintain that person's air, while simultaneously directing 2 other bystanders to specific tasks with the clear, calm authority of someone who had been doing this for years. She had not been doing this for years. She was 23 years old and had arrived at this intersection by chance 60 seconds ago. When the professionals arrived, Emma briefed them on the patient's condition. With precision, she told them the patient's approximate age, visible injuries, respiratory status, and the position she had maintained to protect the airway. She stepped back the moment the professionals took over, without being asked, without drama, without requiring acknowledgement of what she had done. I stood across the street and I watched this, and I felt for the first time in my military career something very close to fear. Not fear of Emma, specifically fear of what Emma represented. She was not trained for emergencies. She was not selected for her qualities in a rigorous process like Danny and LT Unk and GTY's unit had been. She was a random member of the human population, and when the moment required it, she had been exactly what the situation needed. Calm, competent, decisive, and done. I filed my 12th report the following morning. I titled it Species-Wide Emergency Competence Implications for Contact Scenarios. I outlined what I had observed and what I believed it meant for any future military engagement with humanity. The report was received, logged, and categorized as supplementary cultural observation. In my 13th cycle, I gained access to something I had been requesting for years: the human military's own internal assessments of their capabilities and weaknesses. These were not public documents. They were obtained through sources I will not specify. What I found in those documents was both reassuring and deeply alarming. Reassuring because the humans were under no illusions about their technological limitations. They knew their hardware was primitive compared to what was theoretically possible. They knew they had gaps in their capabilities that a sufficiently advanced opponent could exploit. They were not arrogant about What they had, alarming because of what they were doing about it, the pace of human technological development, documented in their own internal projections, was not linear, it was exponential, every generation built on the previous generation's foundation, not incrementally but fundamentally. Technology that was theoretical in one decade was operational in the next, and obsolete in the one after that. The humans themselves were aware of this pattern and were actively designing their military institutions to take advantage of it, building organizational structures that could absorb and integrate new capabilities faster than any opponent could anticipate. One document I reviewed contained a planning scenario that had been prepared for a senior leadership conference. The scenario was fictional, a hypothetical conflict with a technologically superior opponent. The document ran through the scenario in detail, examined the ways in which the technological gap would matter in the early stages of the conflict, and then traced through how human adaptation and innovation would close that gap over time. The document's conclusion was not we would win, it was more honest than that. The conclusion was that with sufficient time, the technological gap between humanity and any conceivable opponent would narrow, and that the primary strategic goal in any such conflict should be to buy that time. I sat with that document for a very long time. I read it 3 times, then I wrote my 14th report, the longest one I had filed, and I asked the observation division for an emergency classification review. They declined the review. My 14th cycle ended. I returned to Dominax, filed my final comprehensive report, and requested an immediate audience with the Military Intelligence Directorate. 3 months later, I was given the opportunity to address the Grand Council. I spent those 3 months preparing to say as clearly and as simply as I could everything I had spent 14 cycles learning, not about human weapons or human numbers or human strategy. Those things were all genuinely primitive by Dominion standards, and there was nothing in those metrics that would have alarmed any rational military planner. What I spent those 3 months preparing to explain was something much harder to communicate, something that had no equivalent in Dominion military doctrine, no category in the intelligence assessment frameworks, no language that quite fitted. I was trying to explain what it meant to be a species that had learned to become stronger every time the universe tried to break it. I was trying to explain that there is a kind of danger that no threat assessment template is designed to measure, because the danger is not in what an opponent has today, but in what they become when you push them. I was trying to explain that the most important fact about humanity was not what they were, it was what they became. The council gave me 40 minutes. I used 37 of them. Concern noted, said Councillor Zareth. The vote was 412 to 11. I walked out of that chamber into the amber afternoon light of Dominax, with Threx at my side and the cold certainty settling in my chest that I had just watched the most powerful civilization in the known galaxy decide to wake something up that it did not understand and could not control. I thought about Danny on the mountain, about George and his morning coffee, about Emma on a sidewalk doing what the moment required with 30 seconds of preparation and a total absence of hesitation. I thought about the humans' own planning document and its quiet, confident conclusion about buying time. I thought about a species that had been catastrophe adapted for so long that catastrophe was no longer something that happened to them, it was something they practiced. And in 140 of their days, when the first Dominion ships translated into Earth orbit on a clear Tuesday morning, the catastrophe was going to come to them from the sky, from something they had not imagined yet in all their detailed fiction about alien invaders. No, that was not right, I corrected myself as Threx, and I walked to the transport. They had imagined it. That was the problem. They had imagined it in extraordinary detail, played it out in hundreds of stories and scenarios, and in almost every version the ending was the same. I had read those stories during my time on Earth. All the generals in them, the ones on the invading side, had one thing in common. They had all made the same mistake. They had all assumed that the humans' lack of advanced technology meant they were not ready. The humans were always ready. The Dominion was about to learn what that meant. The first ship appeared in Earth sky at 6:42 in the morning, local time, over the Atlantic Ocean. I know the exact moment because I was on the bridge of the command vessel, watching the real-time feeds, and I have replayed that timestamp in my mind more times than I can count. 6:42, the sun had been up for 20 minutes on the eastern coast of North America. The western coast was still dark. Most of Asia was in mid-afternoon. The timing had been calculated by the Empire's tactical planning staff to maximize global visibility because the Council had decided that the initial appearance of the fleet should serve a psychological purpose. It should make humanity understand all at once that there was nowhere on their small planet to hide from what was coming. 500 capital ships, the Third Dominion expansion fleet, the largest single military force the Empire had deployed in 600 years, arrayed in a formation that our tactical planners had designed to be visible from the planet's surface with the naked eye, a crescent of metal and light hanging in low orbit, so large and so perfectly arranged that it would be impossible to look at and feel anything other than what the Council intended you to feel, small, alone. Finished, I stood at the viewport and looked down at the planet below. From this distance, it was what it had always been described as in the intelligence briefings, a mostly blue sphere cloud streaked with a brown and green of continents visible between weather systems. It looked quiet. It looked, I will be honest, exactly as fragile as the briefing said it was. My second in command, a Dominion fleet admiral named Voss, stood beside me with an expression I had seen on the faces of officers before many successful integrations. Confidence settled, already thinking about the ceremony. He said, "Fleet is in formation, High General, all systems nominal. Psychological impact phase is underway." "Yes," I said. "Initial projections suggest planetary communications will be disrupted within 4 hours. Surface observation platforms estimate mass panic events across the primary population centers within Voss." I said. He stopped. "Watch," I said. "Carefully, watch everything." He looked at me the way officers looked at commanders who they respected but privately believed had been in the field too long. Then he turned back to his station and began monitoring the fleet deployment. I went back to watching the planet. The first 6 hours played out almost exactly as the tactical plan specified. The fleet electronic warfare Division targeted Earth satellite networks, and one by one the human communication and navigation systems blinked out their orbital assets, the relatively small collection of artificial satellites they had placed around their planet over the previous 70 years went dark. Their global communication networks experienced significant disruption. Their military systems lost access to the space-based positioning data had come to depend on from the command vessel we monitored. The initial response, the first hour, was as predicted, characterized by confusion, emergency communication channels lit up across the planet. Military command structures went to their highest alert states. Civilian populations who had observed the fleet's arrival through telescopes or simply by looking up began flooding whatever communication channels remained available with reports and questions. That was the part that matched the prediction. What happened next did not. By the end of the second hour, something had started changing in the human response patterns. The confusion was not increasing the way our models had suggested it would. Instead, it was resolving, not fully, not cleanly, but where there had been fragmented reactive emergency communications in the first hour, there were now patterns emerging that looked organized, deliberate, pre-planned. Our intelligence staff had known, of course, that the human militaries had contingency plans for various scenarios. Every military does. But contingency plans were theoretical exercises. They were documents that lived in planning offices and were reviewed annually and were in every civilization we had ever encountered, entirely insufficient to cover the actual reality of a situation as unprecedented as 500 capital ships appearing in orbit. The humans had contingency plans for this specific situation. They had given it a name. Translation units rendered it as non-terrestrial intelligence contact. Hostile posture. They had protocols. They had predecided command authorities. They had communication systems that did not rely on the satellite networks we had disabled because they had apparently considered the possibility that a technologically superior opponent might disable their satellite networks first. I made a note. I did not say anything to Voss. By the end of the fourth hour, the human response had shifted again. Our monitoring of their surviving communication channels, land-based, encoded but not entirely opaque to our systems, was capturing something that none of our analysts had expected, and most of them were struggling to process. The human nations were talking to each other, not the panicked, fragmented communications of a civilization in crisis, scrambling to understand what had happened. Structured communication, formal diplomatic channels that were being used right now in the middle of what should have been the most destabilizing event in their species history, to coordinate responses between governments that had been adversaries the day before. A junior analyst brought me the summary. She was a young officer named Leth, and her face, when she handed me the report, had the expression of someone who had just seen something that rearranged a fundamental assumption. They're talking to each other, sir, she said. All of them, the ones who have been in active conflict with each other for decades, the ones who haven't had direct diplomatic contact in years. They're all on the same channels right now. Yes, I said. Is that normal for a species? That it is normal for this species, I said, under these conditions. She looked at the report Again, then back at me, and I could see her doing the mental revision, the updating. She was young enough that it registered immediately rather than being defended against. Good. I went back to my viewport. What I was watching below was not mass panic. What I was watching was something I had seen described in the human history records that Caroline had taught from a phenomenon that appeared at the extreme end of human crisis response, the point at which external pressure applied with sufficient force and clarity overrode the 1,000 internal divisions that normally kept human societies fractured, and produced something rare and extraordinary, and for anyone on the receiving end of it genuinely terrifying. Unity, not the managed institutional unity of a civilization that had achieved lasting peace through negotiation and compromise. Something rarer than that, something older, the unity of a species that had survived a very long time on a complicated and demanding world by learning when the situation required it to stop fighting each other and start fighting whatever had decided to threaten all of them at once. Voss appeared at my shoulder at hour 5. His expression had changed. He still held the confident set of a successful officer, but there was something behind his eyes now that had not been there before, a sharpening, a recalculation. Sir, he said quietly, communications analysis team is flagging unusual patterns in the human military coordination. They're reporting that the level of intergovernment coordination we're observing is not consistent with what the pre-invasion briefing suggested was possible. No, I said, it is not. The integration timeline may need to be reassessed. That is one way to describe it. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, did you expect this? Yes. I said. I reported it 17 times. He did not have a response to that. The landing operation began at hour 7. 40,000 Dominion ground forces, the finest troops in the Empire, equipped with the most advanced personal combat technology in the known galaxy, energy shielding, directed energy weapons, communication systems that operated on frequencies our intelligence staff was confident the humans could not interfere with. The tactical plan called for simultaneous landings at 12 locations across the planet, chosen to maximize strategic control of key population centers and communication hubs. I watched the first landing from the bridge feeds. The insertion craft dropped through the atmosphere and touched down in a large, flat open area outside one of the humans' major cities. The ramp dropped. 40,000 years of Dominion military tradition walked out onto the grass. I want to be precise about the next part. The humans were outnumbered significantly. The engagement in the first landing zone involved approximately 40,000 Dominion ground forces against a human defensive force that our real-time intelligence estimated at somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 personnel. The humans' weapons were chemically propelled projectiles and explosive devices with no energy shielding and no directed energy capability. By every objective measure of military power, it was not a contest. The Dominion forces took the landing zone in approximately 2 hours. They took it intact, which had been the tactical plan. What had not been in the tactical plan was the cost. The human defensive force of 1,000 to 2,000 had inflicted, in those 2 hours, 1,100 casualties on our 40,000 not killed. The Dominion forces did not take those kinds of losses in Integration operations, I want to be clear about that, but 1100 combat. Ineffective personnel in a 2-hour engagement against a force that was outnumbered by a ratio of between 20 and 40 to 1 with vastly inferior technology. That was not a number that any of our tactical models had produced. Voss brought me the preliminary report. Without being asked, he placed it on the console in front of me and stood very still while I read it. The humans had not fought the way our tactical systems had modeled. They had not attempted to hold fixed defensive positions against a technologically superior force, which was what any rational assessment of their situation would have predicted. Instead, they had done something that our planners had apparently considered, but discounted as unlikely. They had let us take the positions we wanted, and then they had made us pay for every step. Beyond those positions, small units, dispersed, coordinated through communication systems, our electronic warfare division had not located or disabled because those systems had apparently been built and positioned specifically for a scenario in which their primary communications infrastructure was unavailable. They had anticipated this. They had specifically, deliberately prepared for a situation in which a technologically superior opponent took out their normal communication grid first. Colonel Allen's phrase came to me: the enemy gets a vote. The humans had given their vote considerable thought. I looked up. From the report, Voss was watching me with an expression that I recognized. It was the expression of a talented officer who had been wrong about something significant and was in the process of adjusting. I respected him for the speed of the adjustment. What is the status at the other 11 landing zones? I said. He told me 9 of the 12 had similar patterns. Human forces vastly outgunned, strategically outmaneuvered by the speed and scale of the landing operation, but extracting costs from our forces at rates that were not catastrophic by any individual measure and were in aggregate something that our logistics models had not budgeted for. At 2 of the landing zones, our forces had encountered something the field commanders were describing in their reports with a kind of careful neutral language that told me they were not yet comfortable with what they were seeing. Small groups of human soldiers, in one case a unit of 11 individuals, had engaged a Dominion force of more than 300. They had not attempted to defeat the force. They had not needed to. They had simply made the forces movement in that sector so costly in time and equipment and personnel that our operational timeline in that region had been delayed by 6 hours. 11 humans. 6-hour delay, force of 300. I thought about Danny arguing with the mountain. At the 12th landing zone, something else had happened. Our forces had touched down without incident, secured the initial perimeter, and then received a communication from the local human command. Not a surrender, not a request for terms. A very brief message transmitted on one of our own communication frequencies, which meant that the humans in that sector had already, within hours of first contact, been working to intercept and understand our communication systems. The message said in the humans' most widely spoken language, which our units could translate in real time: you are standing on our ground. Consider carefully what you do next. I read that message on the field report and felt something I had not felt in 40 years of military service. I felt like I understood Finally, what it must feel like to be the world that is about to be integrated. 2. Look up at the ships in the sky and know what they mean and decide with whatever time and resources you have to make that decision as expensive as possible for the people who made it. The humans were not fighting to win, not yet. They were buying time. They were fighting to buy every day and every hour they could. While something else happened, something our tactical models did not account for. They were learning. At hour 9 I sent my second formal communication to the Grand Council. It was brief. I did not include calculations or projections or analysis. I had tried all of those things already. I wrote 4 sentences. The landing operations are proceeding on schedule and facing unexpected resistance. Resistance is not decreasing as human forces absorb casualties. The resistance is increasing. I recommend immediate cessation of ground operations pending full reassessment. The Council's response came back in 3 hours. Proceed as planned. Initial resistance in integration operations is normal and expected. Maintain operational tempo. I put the response down on the console and looked out at the planet below. The amber light of the human sun was coming over the horizon now on the eastern edge of their North American continent, and from this altitude the Terminator line between night and day looked like a slow brushstroke moving across a blue and brown canvas. Somewhere below that line, in the dark and in the light, both 11 humans were making 300 Dominion soldiers move 6 hours slower than planned, and 1,100 Dominion personnel were not going back to their units today, and a message on our own frequency was waiting for our landing force commander to decide what to do next. And somewhere in a city we had identified as one of their key political centers, in a building that our intelligence had flagged as a primary government facility, a human leader was standing in front of a camera and saying words that our translation units were rendering in real time on the screen beside my viewport. Our analysts had flagged it as significant broadcast. I had asked for the full translation. Today, every nation on this planet has agreed on one thing. The human leader said, "We are going to deal with this together. Our differences, our history, our disputes, all of it waits. All of it can wait because something has come. Our world that assumes we are small, that assumes we are divided, that assumes we will be afraid." She paused. They picked the wrong planet. The broadcast was being transmitted on every available channel across the planet, and from what our monitoring systems could tell, it was being watched by nearly every human on Earth. I had known this moment would come. I had included a version of this scenario in my 3rd report to the Observation Division, in a section I had titled Species Response Threshold. The threshold was the point at which sufficient external pressure caused the human social organism to stop behaving as a collection of competing groups and start behaving as a single unified entity. I had predicted the threshold would be crossed within the first 12 hours of an overt hostile action. It had been crossed in 9. I turned away from the viewport and walked back to my command chair. Voss was watching the same broadcast translation on his screen. His face had gone very still. "She's good," he said quietly, meaning the human leader. "She is exceptional," I said. "They have many like her. That is the point." He looked at me. "What happens now, sir?" I had answered that question Once before, the day after the council vote, standing in a corridor on Dominax, with Thrax at my side, I had said the Empire invades Earth, and then we find out whether I was right. We had found out. Now I said it gets worse. On the 36th hour after the landing operations began, a Dominion patrol craft was brought down over a region the humans called Central America. It was not brought down by a weapon that the humans had possessed when the fleet arrived. That is the fact I want you to understand before anything else, not the loss of the craft itself. We had anticipated some losses. It was what the craft was brought down with. The patrol had been hit by a directed energy burst. Not a large one, not sophisticated by any standard the Dominion would recognize, but a directed energy burst. Nonetheless, from a species that 36 hours earlier had possessed no directed energy technology whatsoever. I read the field report 3 times, then I called my chief intelligence analyst, a careful and methodical officer named Core, to my briefing room and asked her to walk me through what had happened. Core had the good professional habit of delivering bad news without softening it. She laid out the report on the table between us and spoke clearly. Sir, the evidence indicates that within approximately 14 hours of the first landing operations, human tickle teams located and retrieved an intact Dominion forward scout drone in a remote area of their northern continent. The drone was one of the advanced surveillance units we deployed 6 cycles ago before the invasion, which became inoperable after a systems failure and was left in place. We left one behind, I said. We determined the retrieval risk was negligible, sir, given the humans' technological level at the time. At that time, yes, sir, she continued. Human technical teams disassembled the drone based on our analysis of the timeline. They had produced a functioning copy of its directed energy emitter within approximately 20 hours. The copy is crude. It lacks targeting systems, range, and power efficiency. It would not pose a significant threat to a shielded vehicle. The patrol craft was unshielded because it was operating in a presumed low-threat zone. I looked at the report, then I looked at Core. 20 hours, I said. 20 hours to produce a functional copy of technology they had never encountered before, she confirmed. Her voice was very even professional, but there was something in her expression that told me she had been sitting with this information for a while before bringing it to me, turning it over, measuring what it meant. 20 hours, I said again, not because I had not heard her the first time, because I needed to say it again to make sure I understood what I was saying. Korith had been with me for 12 years. She was precise, she was reliable, and she had an excellent instinct for what a field report actually meant versus what it said on its face. She had never in 12 years shown anything I would describe as being shaken by data. She looked shaken. Sir, she said, I need to file an updated threat assessment, the standard framework we use for pre-con civilizations does not have categories adequate for what I am observing. I will need to use the framework we apply to peer-level opponents. Yes, I said, do that. Send it directly to me before it goes to the council. The council may not send it to me first. I sat with the report for a long time. 20 hours the humans had possessed in their own estimation, and hours a total absence of directed energy technology. They had Zero theoretical framework for it, no. Research programs pursuing it, no. Conceptual foundation from which to build it, their physics understood the principles involved, but they had not developed practical applications. This was listed in every intelligence briefing as a fixed constant. Humans have no directed energy weapons capability. They had acquired one in 20 hours by taking apart a machine they had never seen before. I thought about what Colonel Allen had said, the enemy gets a vote. I thought about the human's own planning document, the one that described buying time while the technological gap narrowed. I thought about Caroline teaching her students that humans were catastrophe adapted. I had been thinking about this moment for 14 cycles. I had known it was coming in some form, the specific form, a functional energy weapon reverse, engineered in less than a day, was faster than even I had projected, not impossibly so, but faster. The broader context of the war was by the end of the first week developing along trajectory that I had forecast in my 14th report, and that the Council had refused to believe. The Dominion forces on the ground held every position they had taken. Our technology was genuine, and our troops were genuine, and in direct engagement, the outcomes remained what they had always been in similar conflicts. The side with superior hardware won the direct engagements. We were not losing battles, we were winning every battle, and we were losing the war. A Dominion officer named Commander Briel commanded the forces at one of our primary ground positions, a large transport hub in the human country called Germany. Briel sent me a field report in the second week that I read 3 times and then forwarded to Corps with a request for her analysis. Report described something Briel called, in Dominion military terminology, nonlinear attrition. In plain language, what Briel was describing was this: every time the humans engaged a Dominion force and were repulsed, the next engagement was more difficult than the one before, not by a small increment, by a significant one. The humans were integrating lessons from every encounter with a speed that Briel's experience and models had no category for. A tactic that worked against them on Monday did not work the same way on Wednesday. By Friday they had developed a counter. By the following Monday, the counter had become a new baseline, and they were already working on the next level. It is as if they are learning faster than we can update our training, Briel wrote. My unit commanders are applying doctrine that was effective 2 weeks ago and finding that the humans have already moved past it. I do not have language in our standard reporting framework to describe what I am observing. It is not that they fight harder, it is that they fight differently every time, and the new way is always more effective than the last. I had that language. I had been developing it for 14 cycles, but I had not been listened to when it mattered. And Briel was learning what it described in real time from the business end of weapons that had been primitive 3 weeks earlier. On the 18th day of ground operations, something happened that I consider the precise point at which the shape of the entire engagement became clear. A human unit which our intelligence identified as a mixed force of military and civilian technical personnel managed to reach and secure one of our forward supply depots in a remote area of their Asian continent. The depot was not large, it was a temporary installation supporting about 4,000 Dominion ground troops in the region. Our forces responded quickly and recovered the depot within 6 hours, but in those 6 hours the human team had removed 6 specific pieces of equipment from the depot, not randomly. The 6 items they had taken were, by any objective assessment, the 6 items most useful for understanding the underlying principles of Dominion energy shielding technology. They had known exactly what they were looking for. I called Korth back in. How did they know what to take? I asked. Sir, she said, the directed energy incident, when they recovered the patrol craft we lost, they would have had access to its full systems, including the shielding architecture, and they reverse engineered enough of the architecture to know what components to prioritize in 18 days. Yes, sir. Thought about that for a while, then I asked the question I had been building to: where are we in the projection curve, the one from my 14th report? Korth consulted her data. She had been tracking this. I could tell she had been running the numbers since the moment the first anomalous data started coming in, probably since before she had official authorization to do so. She was that kind of analyst. Based on the current adaptation rate, she said carefully, the humans will have functional energy shielding deployed on their military units in approximately 6 weeks. Our models show a high confidence interval on that figure because the adaptation rate has been remarkably consistent. 6 weeks, I said. Sir, I need to file that threat assessment. Send it. And Corinth, she paused at the door. File a copy with the Military History Archive. Not for the council, for the record. She understood. She nodded once and left. The Grand Council received my third formal warning communication on day 21. I had written it carefully, without anger, without the kind of language that could be dismissed as excessive emotionality. I laid out the data in plain terms: the reverse engineering timeline, the adaptation rate, the projected capability development curve, the 18-day theft at the supply depot. I included Korth's updated threat assessment and Briel's field report, and 17 other field reports from commanders across all 12 landing zones, all of which told the same story in different ways. I concluded with a sentence that I had written and rewritten for 2 hours before settling on its final form. The tactical situation remains in the Dominion's favor. The strategic situation is reversing at a rate that our operational doctrine has no framework to address, and will reach parity within 60 days with human advantage following within 120. The Council's response came back in 38 hours. Reinforce all ground positions. Accelerate resource extraction timeline. Resistance elements are to be treated as obstacles to integration rather than organized military opposition. I read the response. I set it down. I went back to the viewport. On the 31st day, a human soldier named Peter was captured by one of our patrols in a region our field maps designated as Sector 11 in what the humans called Eastern Europe. He was brought to our field command post for questioning under the standard integration protocols, which meant that the questioning was non-harmful and focused on gathering tactical intelligence. Our intelligence officer, following protocol, asked Peter the standard questions: location of human command structures, communication frequencies, disposition of forces, the sector. Peter answered every question with complete cooperation, providing detailed information in a calm and helpful manner. It took our Intelligence analysis team 8 hours to determine that every piece of information Peter had provided was entirely accurate as far as they could verify, and entirely useless. Locations he described were real. Locations, they were real human. Positions, they had been real human. Positions 4 days ago before Peter had been assigned with 7 other soldiers to the specific task of allowing himself to be captured and questioned. The communication frequencies he had provided were frequencies the humans had used and had already rotated away from on a pre-planned schedule. The force dispositions he described matched what our aerial surveillance had recorded. The positions the humans wanted us to see. I read the analysis report and felt something that I can only describe as involuntary respect. Peter had been sent to us deliberately. His entire unit had been assigned to the operation of feeding us accurate but obsolete intelligence through a cooperative captive. In doing so, they had consumed 8 hours of our intelligence team's analysis time and confirmed to us that our surveillance data was reliable, which led us to rely on that data more heavily, which was exactly what they wanted, because the data our surveillance was capturing was the data they were choosing to show us. Our intelligence lead, a careful officer named Dath, brought me the final analysis and said, very quietly, "Sir, I think we need to discuss the possibility that we are being managed." "Yes," I said, "we are." He was quiet for a moment. "How long?" "Since approximately day 3, I said. "They began shaping our intelligence picture as soon as they understood how we were gathering it." Dath was an experienced officer. He had worked intelligence operations for 22 years. He looked at me with the expression of someone who has just discovered that a game they thought they were winning has a second board they were not aware of. "I need to redesign our entire collection methodology," he said. "Yes," I said, "you do, and by the time you finish they will have adapted to the new methodology." He stood there for a moment and I could see him working through the implications. "Sir," he said finally, "is there an end point to this? Is there a condition under which they stop adapting faster than we can respond?" I thought about Caroline's lectures, about Danny on the mountain, about Peter sitting in our interrogation room and answering every question with cheerful accuracy, burning 8 hours of our time with the precision of a professional. "No," I said, "there is not." On day 44 I sent my 4th formal warning to the Grand Council. On day 47, a human pilot named Owen flew a Dominion interceptor in combat against Dominion forces. Interceptor was one we had lost on day 12 in an emergency landing. We had assessed it as too damaged to be of use. Our assessment had been based on a standard damage evaluation that did not account for the possibility that the humans would have it back in operational condition in 32 days using methods and materials that our engineering standards considered completely inadequate. It had performed well enough to down 2 of our craft before Owen took a hit that forced him to eject. He was recovered by human forces before our patrol could reach his ejection site. The Council's response to my 4th warning was 6 words: hold all positions to maintain operational tempo. Voss found me at my viewport that evening. He stood beside me in silence for a long time. Below us on the night side of the planet, the lights of human cities that we had not managed to darken were still burning, a lot of them. The humans had restored a significant portion of their power grid using methods our electronic warfare division had not anticipated, routing around the nodes we had disrupted in ways that were inefficient by Dominion engineering standards and entirely functional in practice. The projection you showed me last week, Voss said, the capability parity estimates 60 days from day 21. I said 43 days from now, and the Council will maintain operational tempo, I said. Voss was quiet, then he said something I had not expected from him. High General, was there a point at which this could have been stopped? Not from the beginning after the landings. I was there a window because it was a serious question from a serious officer who deserved serious answer. Day 2, I said. If we had withdrawn on day 2 before the first reverse engineering incident, before they understood enough of our technology to begin systematic acquisition, we could have withdrawn and they would have had data, but not the critical mass of data that enabled what followed. There would have been a gap. They could not have closed quickly, and now I said the gap is closing. Whether we are here or not, the equipment they have acquired, the knowledge they have built, that does not go away when we leave. They will continue developing it regardless. So the window is closed. The window is closed. Voss looked down at the planet, at the lights that were still burning. Then what are we still doing here? He said it was, I thought, the best question anyone had asked me since this entire sequence of events had begun. Better than anything the Council had asked, better than most of the questions I had asked myself. We were still here because the Council had told us to hold positions and maintain operational tempo. We were still here because the Dominion had never in 600 years of expansion withdrawn from an integration operation that had already begun. We were still here because the institutional logic of the empire was built on the premise that presence equaled commitment and withdrawal equal defeat, and to withdraw now, even for strategically sound reasons, would require the Council to admit that the assessment on which the entire operation was based had been wrong, and the Council did not admit that it had been wrong. What I did not say to Voss, because I was not yet ready to say it to anyone, was the other thing I had been thinking, the thing that lived at the end of the projection curves in Core's analysis, the thing that Peter's cheerful cooperation and Owen's reconstructed interceptor and the energy emitter built in 20 hours were all pointing toward in 43 days on. Core's model, human and Dominion military capability, would reach rough par at the tactical level in the ground theater. That was the 60-day projection from day 21. The projection did not stop there. After parity on the human adaptation curve that Core had been tracking with increasing precision over the previous 4 weeks, the curve continued upward. It did not level off. It did not plateau. It continued at essentially the same rate it had maintained since the first 20-hour reverse engineering incident in Core's projection. By approximately 120 days from day 21, human military capability in the ground theater would exceed Dominion capability. In that theater, 120 days, less than 4 of their months from no directed energy technology whatsoever to exceeding the Dominion standard in 120 days, driven by the most consistent and disciplined learning curve I had ever seen applied to any problem by any civilization in my career. That was the number I had put in my 4th warning to the Council, that was the number they had responded to, with 6 words and an instruction to hold all positions. That was what we were still doing here, holding positions, on a planet that was day by day and hour by hour outgrowing us. I looked at the lights below, burning steadily, patient, not going anywhere. What are we still doing here? Voss had asked. I turned away from the viewport. We are, I said, giving them time to practice. The Armistice Station had been the human suggestion. That was the first thing that struck me when I read the terms. They had transmitted through the back channel communication that a junior human diplomat had quietly opened with our signal staff on day 104, not a demand for unconditional surrender, not a list of grievances, not the kind of triumphant declaration that a civilization would be more than entitled to make after what they had accomplished in the previous 3 months. Straightforward proposal, neutral ground, a station in the outer system that neither side had occupied, and a request that the Dominion send its ranking military officer. They had asked for me specifically by name in both Dominion Standard and their own primary language. I did not know at the time how they knew my name. I learned later. The station called Kelreth 9 had been a Dominion scientific installation for about 40 years, positioned in the cold outer reaches of the Sol system to conduct spectroscopic surveys of the region. It had been abandoned when the decision was made to pursue integration of Earth. Its staff recalled, and its systems put on maintenance mode when the human diplomatic team arrived ahead of our delegation to prepare the space. They had apparently spent their first few hours there going through the station's archived research data. I thought about that afterward. That is a very human thing to do. Arrive at a place, no matter what you are there for, and immediately start learning about it. The human delegation was waiting when our shuttle docked. There were 7 of them, formally dressed the way humans dressed when they wanted to signal seriousness, dark clothing, precise details, no individual ornamentation. They stood in a row on the docking side of the airlock, and I had a moment stepping through of looking at them and being struck by something I had felt occasionally during my 14 cycles of observation on their planet. Humans are physically small compared to most Dominion species. They are compact and lightly built and would not register as physically imposing at any formal assessment. I knew this. I had known this for years. It was in every briefing, and yet standing in a row in a room on a cold station in the outer system, facing the general of the fleet that had spent 4 months occupying their planet, they did not look small. They looked like people who had been through something very serious and had come out the other side with the particular quality that George the paramedic had described to me in a kitchen in Wales: the willingness to get up and go to work. Anyway, the lead diplomat stepped forward. She was a woman of perhaps 50, with gray at her temples and a direct way of holding herself that reminded me of every experienced field commander I had ever respected. She gave her name, Claire. She looked at me steadily and said, "Excellent Dominion Standard. General V. Khan, we appreciate your willingness to meet." Her Dominion Standard was good enough to suggest either years of study or a very effective translation implant given the timeline, and I suspected the implant 48 hours of preparation time and access to Dominion communication records, and they had built translation implants. I did not say this because it was not the Time for that kind of observation, but I noted it. Ambassador Claire, I said, I appreciate the choice of venue. We sat across a table from each other in the station's primary conference room. No weapons, which had been stipulated. The terms, no tactical staff by mutual agreement, 7 humans, 4 of my most senior people, and a communications team to ensure accurate translation of everything said. Claire opened without ceremony. We have a single primary request, she said. Recognition as a fully sovereign tier 1 civilization with permanent representation on the Galactic Council and an absolute guarantee of territorial sovereignty over the Sol system, including the right to expand independently into adjacent space. In exchange, we are prepared to agree to a full cessation of hostilities, the return of all Dominion personnel currently in our custody, and the establishment of formal diplomatic and trade relations. I had anticipated this. I had briefed my team on it during the transit to the station. The humans were not asking for the things that conquering civilizations typically asked for in reversal scenarios, reparations, concessions, punitive terms. They were asking for the thing that every Dominion member world had been promised and almost none had actually received. Equality, not justice for the invasion, not acknowledgement of what had been done, not resources or territory beyond their own. Equality, a seat at the table, the right to be left alone. I had been authorized by the Council to negotiate a settlement. The authorization had come reluctantly after Corps' final projection analysis had been transmitted to them and could no longer be classified as the excessive pessimism of a general who had spent too long on Earth. The analysis showed that by day 140, if the current development curve continued, the Dominion would face an opponent at technical parity who also held the home ground advantage and was operating on interior lines within their own system. The Council had at that point added one more category to their understanding of the Sol system problem. Alongside the military analysis, they had begun consulting the economic projections, and what the economic showed was that the cost of continuing to escalate to match the human capability curve was not one that the Dominion Treasury could sustain indefinitely. Humans adapted by building. Every capability they developed required infrastructure, supply chains, production facilities. The Dominion was fighting an enemy that was literally growing an industrial base calibrated to defeating them while they watched. The Council's authorization to negotiate had contained predictably list of terms they wanted me to secure: protectorate status rather than full sovereignty, limited representation rather than full Council membership, resource access agreements that would benefit the Dominion economically, regardless of the political outcome. I had read the Council's terms on the transit and put them aside. Across the table from me, Claire was watching me with the careful attention of someone who had been briefed extensively on who I was. I had been told that the human delegation had prepared thoroughly for this meeting. I had been told they had research. I did not know what research until she spoke. General, she said, before we go into the formal negotiation, I want to say something that is not part of our official position, something personal. I indicated that she should continue. Before the invasion began, you gave a speech to your Grand Council. You advised against it. You described our Species in terms that, I will be honest, surprised everyone on our team when we read it. She paused. You told them we were adaptive. You told them that what they were seeing as weakness was a different kind of strength. You told them that the history of what we had survived should make them reconsider. She held my gaze. They didn't listen. But we read what you said. A full transcript reached us on day 3. We think through your own communications, intercepts that we had already begun accessing, and your assessment of us. General, the honest one, written after 14 years of actually paying attention, was shared with every unit and command level on our side within 72 hours of us obtaining it. I was quiet for a moment. I had suspected something of this kind. The specificity with which the human forces had targeted our vulnerabilities. In the early days, the precise intelligence about which Dominion systems to prioritize, it had pointed to either extraordinary intuition or very good source material. You used it as a planning document. I said we used it as confirmation. Claire said that the way we fight, the way we adapt, the way we organize when we have to, that it works. That someone who had spent 14 years watching us and was genuinely trying to be objective came to the same conclusions we come to when we think honestly about ourselves. She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at me. You told them the truth about us, and they didn't believe you, and that truth is the reason we are sitting here today, instead of somewhere considerably worse. I did not have an immediate response to that. I'm not certain there is a proper response to being told that your professional assessment of an opponent, ignored by your own government, was used by that opponent as a psychological foundation for their own defense. I thought about Threx asking me in the corridor what happens now. I thought about Voss at the viewport asking what we were still doing there. I thought about Cora's face when she brought me the 20-hour reverse engineering report and the careful professional language she had used to describe something that had genuinely shaken her. I thought about Danny on the mountain arguing with the rain. Ambassador, I said, I want to be clear about my authority in this room and what I am going to do with it. She waited. I am authorized by the Grand Council to negotiate terms within specific parameters. Those parameters are designed to preserve Dominion economic interests while conceding the minimum necessary on sovereignty questions. I paused. I am not going to negotiate within those parameters. Across the table, I saw something shift in Claire's expression. Not surprise. Exactly, more like the careful attention of someone who is listening very hard to make sure they have heard correctly. What I am going to recommend to the Council, I continued, is an unconditional acceptance of your primary terms: full sovereignty, full Tier 1 recognition, full council representation, territorial guarantee, no protectorate provisions, no resource access agreements, no secondary conditions, the terms you stated. You walked in. The human delegation was very still. Why? Claire asked. Because it is the correct outcome, I said, not because the Dominion has the generosity to offer it, because it is the only arrangement that reflects what is actually true about your civilization, standing relative to ours and building a formal relationship on any other foundation would produce a relationship built on a fiction that your capabilities would disprove within a decade regardless. She was quiet for a moment. The Council will accept this. I will make the recommendation. What they do with it is their decision, but I have found in 40 years of service that councils are more willing to accept accurate information when the alternative has been sufficiently demonstrated. I looked at her steadily. I think the alternative has been sufficiently demonstrated. Claire looked at the other members of her delegation, then back at me. There was a conversation happening in that glance that I did not have the cultural vocabulary to fully decode, but I could read enough of it to understand that what she said next was agreed upon. General, she said, there is one more thing our delegation would like to raise, not a formal request, not a negotiating term, more of a question. Go ahead. After this is concluded, after the formal relationship is established, would the Dominion be open to a joint academic exchange? Specifically, we have been developing a comprehensive analysis of the last 4 months from our perspective, the tactical and strategic patterns, the adaptation methodology, what worked, what did not, what we learned. She held my gaze. We would like to share it with the Dominion military, not as a threat, not as a demonstration of what we are capable of, as a contribution to the body of knowledge about how civilizations can engage with each other without it coming to this. I looked at her for a long moment. Species that had just successfully resisted an invasion by a galactic level military power was offering to share the methodology of that resistance, not to make the Dominion afraid of what they would learn to make the galaxy better at avoiding this particular mistake in the future. I thought about Caroline teaching military history as the story of what humans became under pressure, about George getting up every morning and going to work because not trying was worse than being afraid, about Emma on a sidewalk doing what the moment required, about Peter cooperating completely and helpfully with our intelligence team while feeding us obsolete information with professional precision. I would be personally in favor of that exchange. I said. Good, Claire said. Then let us begin. The formal session took 11 hours. It was the most complex negotiation I had participated in 40 years of service, and the humans came to every table in it with the same discipline and precision that I had watched them apply to everything else in those 4 months. They knew exactly what they wanted. They understood the Dominion's positions with a depth that continued to impress and occasionally alarm my team, and they gave ground only where they had clearly decided in advance that giving ground was strategically sound. At hour 7, a young member of the human delegation, a man named Nathan, who was perhaps 25 years old and had said very little during the first 6 hours, asked a procedural question that resolved a deadlock in the resource treaty language that my team had been working on for 90 minutes. In 4 sentences, I watched him do it and thought, he will be one of the ones who shapes what comes next. 25 years old, in the room where his civilization's formal galactic status was being established, doing the work with calm competence and not a trace of self-consciousness about how extraordinary the situation was. That is the most human thing about them. They adapt to the extraordinary by making it ordinary, by simply doing the next necessary thing with whatever they have, at whatever speed is required. At hour 11, we signed the armistice of Kelrath. 9 was, as I had told my team it would, be an unconditional acceptance of the human primary terms, full sovereignty, full Tier 1 recognition, full council representation. The council had transmitted their objections during the session. I had acknowledged them and proceeded. That would have consequences for my career. I understood this and had made my peace with it during the transit to the station. Some things matter more than careers. After the signing, as both delegations were preparing to depart, Claire found me standing at one of the station's observation ports, looking out at the cold dark of the outer system. She stood beside me for a moment without speaking, looking at the same darkness. Then she said, "You have been to our planet. You know our world." "Yes," I said. "What did you think of it?" I considered the question seriously. I thought about the amber light on English cobblestones, about the sharp mineral smell of Dominax that I had never been able to stop missing when I was away, about a rainy hillside in Wales and a young soldier arguing with the weather. I thought it was a difficult world, I said, cold in the winter, complicated, full of conflict and noise and problems that your species had not yet solved. I paused. I thought it was the most interesting place I had ever been. Assigned. Claire smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that contained a great deal that was not being said. "We think so too," she said. She left to rejoin her delegation, and I stood at the port for a while longer. The Dominion shuttle would take me back to the fleet. Fleet would begin the long process of withdrawal from the Sol system under the terms of the armistice. The Grand Council would conduct its reviews and assign its responsibilities, and the political fallout of the past 4 months would be sorted through in the careful institutional way that governing bodies sorted through their failures. I would file my final report on the Sol system engagement. I had been drafting it in my head since the day after the vote, since Threx had asked me in the corridor what happened now, and I had already known the answer. The report would say what it had always needed to say, stated as plainly as I could state it in language that could not be categorized as cultural supplementary data and tabled indefinitely. It would say that the greatest danger in any contact situation was not the gap between what an opponent currently possessed and what you possessed. Gap was a measurement. The gap was a numbers could be managed. The real danger was the gap between what you understood about an opponent and what was actually true. That gap did not show up in any intelligence briefing. It lived in the spaces between the data points, in the parts of a civilization's nature that could only be seen by someone who was willing to look at it honestly, without the filter of what they wanted to see. I had looked at humanity honestly for 14 cycles. I had told the truth about what I saw. I had been wrong about nothing. I had been ignored, and we had paid the price for being ignored. And the price had been paid in Dominion lives and Dominion resources, and 4 months of this fleet sitting in the sky of a planet that grew stronger and more organized and more capable with every day it spent having to deal with us. Humanity had not needed us to become what they became. They would have become it anyway in time, but we had accelerated it. We had given them a reason to focus that collective intelligence and that legendary adaptive capacity on a single unified problem. And they had done what they always did. When the pressure was sufficient, they had organized. The report would also say, and this part I intended to make impossible to ignore or dismiss, that the armistice of Kelreth 9 was not a defeat, it was a correction. The defeat had happened before the first ship entered the Sol system. In the moment, the Council looked at data I had provided and chose not to see what it showed. The correction was sitting across a table from Claire and her colleagues and acknowledging the truth that the Dominion had encountered a civilization that was not less than us, that was simply different from us, that operated on principles our frameworks had no category for, and that those principles produced outcomes our frameworks could not predict. I had known this for 14 cycles. I had one more thing to do before I left the station. A small thing, but it mattered to me. I found the station's Archivist system and sent a message through the diplomatic communication channel that had been established for use between the two delegations during the armistice process. It was addressed to the academic archive of the university in England, where I had spent my first year. On Earth, it was addressed technically to the Department of Military History. It was a letter, not a formal communication, not a report, a letter. It said that I had audited the department's introductory survey course many years ago under a cover identity, that I could not then disclose that the course had been taught by a named Caroline, who had explained to a room full of students that humanity was catastrophe adapted as if it were an obvious and unremarkable fact. It said that the observation had turned out to be the most important professional assessment I had made in 40 years of service. It said that I hoped the department continued to teach the course. Then I closed the channel, walked back through the docking corridor, boarded the shuttle, and went home. The universe, I have found, does not give warnings twice. It delivers them once clearly to anyone willing to listen. What happens after that is a choice. I had done my best to make the right one. Whether the Empire learned from it was their choice, not mine, but I had learned from it. 14 cycles of learning applied too late to prevent something that did not need to happen, but perhaps applied in time to ensure that what came next was built on something more durable than the convenient fiction that an unfamiliar kind of strength was weakness in disguise. I had spent 40 years learning how to win wars. It took one species of stubborn, short-lived, brilliant, and entirely improbable survivors to teach me what victory actually costs and why the wisest generals never let it come to this. I hoped whoever read my final report understood that